is Aida Weber, and very, very happy to be here today to talk to you about this very important topic, to drive or not to drive. I will tell you a little bit about myself, and then I'll have Jessica tell you guys a little bit about her and her experience. I'm an occupational therapist as well as a certified driving rehab specialist. I've been working for Courage Kenny Rehab Institute for the past 6 years just doing driving. We were formerly known as the Courage Center, as some of you probably have known us from that. We have established our driving program in 1978. Since that time, we've seen thousands of clients that come through our doors, and we assess anywhere between newer drivers from age, I think I've seen my newest driver as being age 14 to age 101 was my oldest driver that I've assessed. So we see anyone where parents aren't really sure whether or not their child or son or daughter should or shouldn't drive. So people with cerebral palsy or autism, we see that lots of times, to middle-aged clients that have traumatic brain injuries or strokes or amputations, to the older driver, which we're going to really talk more about today, that have Alzheimer's or dementia or mild cognitive impairments or Parkinson's or MS or what have you. So we see a whole gamut of people. We do provide comprehensive driving assessments, in which we will, I will go into more detail about that. We also offer equipment evaluations. We are also a certified driving school, so we provide behind the wheel lessons for younger folks or clients that may need adaptive equipment in order to drive. We also provide vehicle modification evaluations, where we kind of see how we can modify the vehicle to best meet that person's disability. I will give it to Jessica and let her talk about herself.
Hi, I'm Jessica Kiecker. I've been at the VA for the past 10 years doing driving rehab for the past 9 years. Similar to Aida, we do offer comprehensive driving assessments, equipment. Ours differs in a little bit of an aspect that we are mainly servicing veterans and active duty service members. So usually our population are not new drivers like a teenage driver. They have some experience with driving. The different diagnoses that we see, traumatic brain injury, stroke, spinal cord injuries, amputations, people that have diabetic neuropathy and can no longer use their feet to drive, and then also going into more the older adult, mature driver and dementia, as Aida had mentioned. All right, Warren kind of went through some of these overview of what we'll be talking about, but more specifically, just how can dementia impact driving? When would a driving assessment be appropriate? What is a driving assessment, and what are the expectations from a driving assessment? What do we do if we can no longer drive? And more so going into some of those transportation options and having some of those conversations. And how can one maintain their independence when they can no longer drive? So for most of us, driving represents independence, freedom, and choice. The one thing that we always need to remember is that driving is a privilege and not a right. So it's not promised to everyone. Not everyone has the abilities or the skills to be able to drive. You get a license based on your skills, and with that license, you have to follow the rules and agree to follow them. So we just need to think that it is actually a privilege to be able to drive and not always a right. You earn that privilege to be able to drive when you go to the state DMV, pass the test, and get your driving license. So even in the early stages of dementia, driving may be a safety concern. Clients with dementia may tend to minimize the complexity of driving as well as overestimate their abilities to drive. And we'll go more into some of the specific skills required for driving and abilities.
Okay. Okay, so in your packets, we have a copy of the actual presentation, but beyond that, you should have also some papers that have ways to start a conversation with your loved one that may be afflicted with Alzheimer's dementia, to kind of open up conversation about driving. And that's really important. You want to talk about driving before driving can become a problem. Because a lot of times when people are first diagnosed with Alzheimer's or dementia, you may have seen symptoms maybe a year before that, okay? So you have to kind of think along those lines and how that may be affecting your driving. So those packets of papers in your handouts, that may be a way to kind of go through questions and open up that conversation. I know a lot of family members are very hesitant in talking to their loved one about driving because it's a sticky topic because a lot of people want to keep driving just like Warren's dad and just be kind of stubborn about it, but just being very clear about what are the consequences if you do have an accident or if you do get lost, what can actually happen. So these are ways to prevent future potential crises like car accidents or getting lost. It also is a way for your loved one to have some kind of choice in the matter and just saying, you know what, I think I am going to change a couple of things about my driving if that is okay with you, and have that conversation with your family member. Also a way to decrease family conflict. There are lots of times when we get clients that come see us that are very adamant about driving. And finally, the family's like, okay, I will be okay with you driving as long as you get a driving assessment done, okay? And also reduces confusion and fear on both parties, whether it's the family member or the client, because the client is very fearful about their privilege of having their driving taken away, and the family member may be scared that, I don't know when my loved one might get in an accident or they may get lost. So these conversations will be kind of crucial. There's no easy way to start that conversation. Again, using those packets to kind of go through the checklist and kind of observing that driving behaviors over time. Because obviously, in the beginning stages of Alzheimer's or dementia, it's going to look very different in their ways of driving to their end stages. And so you're going to have to probably revisit those conversations throughout that time. Also involve your medical professional, your doctor, in on the conversation is very, very important so that they know where they're at, looking at their overall medical history as well as their medications that might be affecting their driving. And again, going through the agreement with my family about driving in your packet, you should have that in there.
So early on, you can start making some small changes. So driving shorter distances, driving only to familiar locations. So if someone lives locally here in Roseville, maybe limiting their driving and just running errands a few miles from home. Also avoiding night driving in heavy traffic or during rush hour times, or even when driving, making sure there's no distractions in the car. So a lot of these things you can implement kind of early on and start making those limitations and restrictions for your driving to prevent future accidents. And we'll go a little bit more through some of those checklists later to come up with some more tips. So the one thing, looking at how does dementia affect driving? So it affects cognitive functions necessary for driving. So our judgment. So if we're going down the road, and even if it's a familiar route, and there is all of a sudden some construction, how do we maneuver around that construction? How do we make good judgment calls to go the right way that the arrows are facing? Another big one with judgment would be uncontrolled left turns. So turning onto a road that it's not controlled and making sure that you have the appropriate gap in traffic, that you are making that left turn safely. Also, orientation, reaction time. So when we are driving and looking down the road, how quick we notice the stop signs, and our brain tells us then to use our foot to react in time. So that reaction time, that visual processing speed. Ability to problem solve. Also through complex traffic areas, and then into, like I had mentioned before, an area that you might be familiar with, but all of a sudden the road's tore up. How do you problem solve through that and follow those directions appropriately and safely? Concentration and attention kind of go hand in hand. So our ability to attend to the task at hand, not just what's in front of us, but what's all around us in our surroundings is very important. So sometimes a very common mistake that we see behind the wheel might just be, we call it tunnel attention. The person's just paying attention to what's in front of them, but they're missing those pedestrians on the side. They're missing the other traffic signs like speed limit signs, and being aware of all of those things with concentration and that divided attention. So that's attending to two things. And then also coordination. So it is important with coordination with our arms and our legs for steering, and then also regulating the gas and the brake pedal. The other thing that we just need to remember is that the normal aging process can also affect our driving skills. So just within the normal aging process, our reaction time slows down, our thinking skills slow down. So on top of that, if we do have a disease like dementia, then that's kind of a double whammy.
Okay, so a little bit about some research that has been done with clients that have had Alzheimer's and dementia. They are more likely to get into car accidents. There's a higher risk of that. One of the things that we do before a person comes to us to do a comprehensive driving assessment, we like to send out surveys to kind of find out from the client as to how they mark their driving. Okay, so they might have questions like, have you been in an accident in the last couple of years? Do you have any trouble with staying in your own lane? Or have you gotten lost in familiar areas? So those kinds of questions. We will also give that survey to a caregiver, okay, that same exact survey. It is amazing how different those surveys can look like when we see them completed after they come see us. So we take a look at those assessments, and that kind of gives us kind of a feel for, the insight of this client may not be so good, because on their survey, they may say they haven't had any accidents. But on the family survey, they may say they have 7 accidents. So very different. And so this is pretty much saying that a report from the Academy of Neurology indicates that the good predictor of driving abilities is a caregiver assessment. So if a caregiver feels like when they're riding in the car with their loved one and they're kind of questioning their ability to drive, it's probably very accurate report. And so I usually like to ask too after, or sometime during that, if there's a break during the comprehensive assessment, if there's a loved one or some kind of caregiver, I like to talk to them about their drive, about that client's driving before I go on the drive with them to kind of see if they have any concerns. So some warning signs that may indicate a need for driving assessment, okay? So it can go from getting lost, okay, just like Warren's dad, for hours and not really realizing it. It can also look like they're not signaling the right way. They may want to go right, but they're in the left lane and they have their left signal on. They may get confused between what exit to get off on if they're on the highway. They can gas for the brake. I've had a couple of clients I've had that, where they actually hit a building because they didn't realize that they were hitting the gas instead of a brake. There's lots more dents in their car, and they may minimize that, and they say, oh, someone else hit me, when I was backing up. I hear that time and time again. They may need help from their loved one or their caregiver where they are co-piloting from the passenger seat of a car, where they are pretty much telling them, you got to turn left, you got to turn right, oh, you can go now, that is actually not allowed in Minnesota. That used to be a restriction in Minnesota where they can have a co-pilot in the car to help them. But nowadays, they are not allowing that because that co-pilot doesn't have a brake on their side. There's not enough reaction time from the time they tell that driver to stop to stopping, okay, to prevent a potential accident. Driving inappropriate speeds. So a lot of times when I'm on these comprehensive assessments, I might see that person driving really, really slow, like maybe 20 miles underneath the speed limit, or they may be going really, really fast and not even realizing that. So those are some of the warning signs that somebody may need a driving assessment.
So touching back on disorientation and getting lost, in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease, persons are sometimes able to orient themselves in a more familiar setting, but become disoriented when they leave home, similar to the example with Warren's father. This could cause someone to get lost while driving or trying to enter new places, new locations, bigger locations like a church or a mall. So the one thing we need to remember is memory loss or changes in vision and perception can even make familiar environments look unfamiliar at times when we are in that state of disorientation and we can't remember. While most patients will wander on foot, 44% of people with Alzheimer's disease commonly get lost while behind the wheel from a car. According to a study published in the Journal of American Geriatric Society in 1988, 40% of those with Alzheimer's who drove are involved in car crashes.
Okay, so if you have any concerns about yourself with driving or your loved one or significant other driving, you can contact someone like us. So here are some numbers that you can contact for Courage Kenny. The bottom number, the 612-775-2831, is my number, so you can contact me if you have any specific questions. And then to schedule an assessment, it's the bottom number. Excuse me. Yes. Mm-hmm.
They're with the slideshow presentation. So similar, if you have any specific questions, you can contact me. The VA is a little bit different of a ball game. To schedule an assessment, it does need to come from your primary care physician or a specialty care physician within the VA system. And just even going into if you have any specific questions, if you are a veteran, and how you can become eligible to be seen within the VA. Their information is on here. The first or the second bullet, I would go to the Patient Access Center to just discuss on eligibility and if your loved one is eligible to be seen at the VA, because there's all kinds of certain requirements and eligibility on that. Looking at who can refer for a driving assessment, more specifically, like I said, within the VA system, a referral does need to come from a primary care physician, but within that also too, if there's a loved one that calls the primary care physician or a caregiver to contact them, and the physician can put in a referral that way. More privately, it's a little bit different as far as referrals. They will accept referrals by yourself or from yourself, family, friends, even a therapist. Like if you were in a recent hospital stay and had a change of medical status or in a transitional care unit, and a occupational therapist might refer you to a comprehensive driving evaluation from there. An MD, privately this is not required but highly encouraged to come from the MD, can also be referred from the state, and then there may be some other referral sources privately that you might be able to be referred from for a driving eval.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'll talk to you guys about what Courage Kenny, our driving assessments, are what we offer. Okay, so we have 5 people on our team right now, and all 5 of us are occupational therapists and certified driving rehab specialists. So when you come see us, we will have that medical background to help assess that person. As well as we are licensed driver instructors through the state of Minnesota. We have multiple kinds of vehicles that we use for our driving assessments. For these purposes, most of the time for just a comprehensive driving assessment with a client that has Alzheimer's and or dementia, we use what's called our low-tech sedans. And so it's just a regular Ford Fusion or a Taurus or a Chevy Impala. And we do have abilities to put in equipment if that person has a physical disability. So if somebody needs hand controls or a left foot gas pedal or a right turn signal extension, we can put those types of things in that sedan. But if it's just somebody to see if they're safe driving, we'll just use our sedan. A lot of people ask me, time and time again, why can't I drive my own car? I feel more comfortable in my car. Because our car has a brake on our side. And believe me, it has saved our lives for a long time. So that's why we use our car, and I have to reiterate that to that person time and time again. Now, with that being said, we don't go to the car and say, okay, get in and drive. You know, we will orient you to that car and show you where everything is. And we recognize that it is a new car, okay, and that, you know, you'll have that little bit of a learning curve. But a car is a car. You know, you have the same steering wheel, same gas and brake for the most part. So we recognize that. We do have a minivan as well, and those are mostly for people that are in wheelchairs, okay, so, and that also has the ability to put in adaptive equipment. And we also offer driving lessons if that person needs some more additional training after the assessment is done, and if it was also recommended after the assessment was performed. Now, what is a driving assessment, first of all? And has anyone here has ever witnessed a driving assessment or has done a driving assessment? Okay, good. So a couple of you. I'm sorry, just a classroom. Okay. So our driving assessments, it's kind of a long process. We schedule it on a 3-hour basis. During those 3 hours, we have what's called the clinical part as well as the behind the wheel part. The clinical part is getting to know you, okay, interviewing and talking about the completed surveys that you received in the mail that we mentioned before. We also just kind of get a feel for just overall medical history and your driving history. And then I go into more testing because I want to see what the skills are for driving. So, you know, everyone needs a certain amount of vision for driving, so I test different parts of your vision. I test also just how you're physically moving and if you need any kinds of adaptive equipment, okay? I also test reaction time as well as different cognitive skills. So if somebody comes see me for a driving assessment and they have Alzheimer's dementia, I will probably focus a lot more on the cognitive areas to see where they're at. And that part usually takes about an hour or so, all right? And then the second part is the behind the wheel portion. I would say about 95% of our clients, we do take them on the behind the wheel portion. A lot of people ask me, well, if they didn't do well in the clinical part, why are you taking them on the behind the wheel part? Because sometimes some people just, it doesn't compare. Some people just don't test well in the clinic, but on the drive, they may surprise us, okay? So that's why we like to do two parts. And if we know that it's not going well in the clinic, but if we don't take that person behind the wheel and we give them recommendations that they shouldn't drive, that person can just say, you never saw me drive, right? So that's why we want to see that person drive. We want to give that person a fair amount of chance. So during the behind the wheel portion, we go out, I have a set route that we go on because I want to see that person driving in different scenarios. I want to see them maybe in a busy parking lot, especially if they say, all I go to is my grocery store or my church. I want to see them in a busier parking lot then. And then I also take them on some residential areas. Sometimes I take them in some little busier areas where I see how they drive in the, how they lane change, how they negotiate decision making at different turns, you know, whether it's a unmarked intersection or some areas where they have some stop signs or some stop lights. So I want to see a variety of areas. I also ask them beforehand, where do you usually go? You know, because if someone stopped driving on freeways, I'm not going to take them out on a freeway. But if they do still continue driving on freeways, I do want to see a little bit of that. So I add that to their behind the wheel portion. So in the drive portion usually takes about anywhere between 30 to 45-minute drive. Okay. Now after the behind the wheel portion, we come back into the center, and then I finish typing the report, and then I go over the results with the client and their significant other or loved one or whatever. And so we'll talk about the results of the clinic and the behind the wheel portion, and you will get recommendations. Okay. We don't release the information to the state of Minnesota. All right. So that's why beforehand we usually ask the client if they give us authorization to give the information to a doctor, and the doctor can report to the state. Okay, so that's usually how it works. But you also have the authority to say no. All right. Locations. So we offer our driving assessments in a number of different locations around the Twin Cities area. So it's all in your packets. Okay, so a little bit more about the clinical part. So like I said, we go into the medical history. You know, have you been hospitalized in the last couple of years, and what have you been, why were you there, and how long were you there? Did you get rehab? Kinds of things. Also taking a look at their driving history. Have you been in accidents in a couple of years? Have you had any issues where you got lost? You know, asking those kinds of questions. What medications are you on? Are you on any pain medications that can alter your thinking process? Community living skills. Are you driving right now, or are you taking public transportation? So some of the questions about that. Physical status. Are you using a walker? You know, are you can you not walk long distances? So that endurance factor also comes into play. Vision. Are you do you have any other visual issues, like glaucoma or macular degeneration? Or do you need cataract surgery, or have you had cataract surgery? I will also test their visual motor, their reaction time, and those cognitive skills in different ways. All of our tests that we use in our clinic is standardized tests, and they've been backed by research. Like I said, for the behind the wheel portion, I take a look at, first of all, you know, are they able to control a vehicle, or are they mistaking the gas for the brake? Are they having trouble staying in their own lane when they're driving? And do I constantly have to grab the wheel to, you know, let them know, okay, we need to stay in this lane? Are they having some trouble? Do I notice that they're driving really, really slow to find a destination? Because I might say, okay, up ahead, I want you to find the Target, and I want you to park in front of Famous Footwear. So if they're trying to find it and they're going 10 miles an hour in a 45 45 mile per hour zone, that's something for me to kind of notate. Are they identifying risk situations? You know, when we're going on the freeway and they're merging onto the freeway, do they just kind of look straight ahead and not realizing I'm not noticing other cars on the freeway before I get there? Okay, so lots of different things I'd take a look at, as well as, are they missing some stop signs? Okay, are they missing a school zone? Okay, with lights flashing. I've had a client that, you know, almost passed a bus with red lights and a stop sign out. Okay, so those are things that we have to look at too. And so after the clinic and the behind the wheel portion is done and we go over the results, these are potential outcomes that we talk about. And I always talk about these potential outcomes at the start too, so they know what to expect, so that they're not surprised. Okay, so I always tell them, you know, I can either say that you may be safe to drive, keep driving in your regular driving areas, okay, or I might recommend continue to drive with certain restrictions. So those restrictions can be either that just drive within a certain mile radius from home. Okay, so somebody says, I only go to the grocery store, I only go to church, and that's 5 miles away. Then I could say, drive within a 5 mile radius from home if I felt like that was a safe choice. Also, another restriction may be daytime only, or no freeway, or no rush hour. Okay, those are the formal restrictions that can be on the back of your license. Other things, I might recommend some adaptive equipment for people that have some physical disabilities, or they may need driving lessons. I might recommend that. Or if they had a stroke and they came a little too early for the driving assessment, I might say, you know what? Let's go back and do some therapy. Let's go back and do some OT or PT. Come back and see me in 6 months and let's see where we're at. Sometimes I might have someone that might need an extended assessment. So these are clients that may have done not so well in the clinical part, but they drove okay for the behind the wheel portion, but I still had some concerns. So I might say, you know what, let's do some driving lessons from your house, okay? And if I see that you are driving okay within your familiar areas and within your areas that you usually go to, then I might recommend some restrictions on your license. So that's what's called an extended assessment, okay? Or the last part is no driving. So I have to use my brake a couple of times and I have to grab my wheel a couple of times during the behind the wheel portion. Then I will recommend retiring from driving. And that's where I will give that person a list of alternative transportations and a list of community resources. I know Warren had made a couple copies of those lists, and I think you may have picked some up in the back, and they're for Hennepin County as well as Ramsey County.
So looking at funding resources, the unfortunate part is that behind the wheels are not covered by insurance companies. So usually the behind the wheel portion needs to be paid in some way. So that can be either private pay. Sometimes through the state there might be vocational rehab services that do pay for the behind the wheel. Specifically at the VA, if you are a veteran in the system, it is covered. Specifically, there might be some co-pays, but that's for everyone's individual basis depending on their eligibility. But within the VA system, I know sometimes we have veterans that are connected to the VA, but they might be seen after disease or injury at Courage Center, and if they know they're a veteran and they're already connected with the system, then they'll refer them to us so they don't have to pay privately, and they are then seen within the VA system. Also, there's some other societies out there, like the MS Society, Multiple Sclerosis Society, that provides funding for behind the wheel assessment and training. Sometimes the county programs, so the Caddy waiver through state funding sources, workers' compensation, AAA discount, and then cost share. And then a couple years ago when I was at the National Driving Conference, a lot of the information in your packets came from, it's called Hartford, and they do a lot of education with aging, dementia, and driving. And they had told us at that time that they actually offer insurance for vehicles. And within the new insurance policy, they actually will cover a behind-the-wheel driving evaluation. So what's unique within that, just through the American Association of Occupational Therapy, when we were discussing this, we hope more and more insurance companies like American Family or State Farm might go towards that to be able to cover these things because they are noticing, obviously, the importance of having these evaluations.
So for our our comprehensive driving assessments, we charge $414, okay? And then we do offer AAA or AARP discounts, and that's $394. If you have medical assistance, you do have a discount for our cost share program, so that can anywhere between $120 to $130, depending on your income. I'm trying to think of any other things, but yeah, those are, yes. And then your written report afterwards. So a lot of people ask me, that's quite a bit of money, and it is. However, it is a lot cheaper than getting into an accident and getting potentially sued. So you have to think about it that way too. That's a very good question. Did everyone hear that? So the question was, do you ever test in the afternoon, especially for those clients that may have what's called sundowning? Sundowning is a process where their cognitive abilities tend to decrease in the afternoons. And so the answer is to that question is we do offer afternoon appointments, but our last appointment is typically around 2 to about 5 o'clock. So it is a little bit later, but not beyond that. Okay, but that is a very good question. And that's something that we can also talk about, or put that in the surveys, and have that so that the evaluator understands that that is an ongoing issue with that client.
So if you have a valid driver's license, you can legally drive. However, if your symptoms are affecting your driving abilities and you do not voluntarily stop, you may be at fault or at risk for getting sued, just like Ida had mentioned. So someone could charge that you knowingly drove with a disability that could put you and others at risk for an injury. And the one thing that I think is interesting is I come back to think when we all go renew our license, there's a little checkbox on there that says, has your medical history changed? And a lot of people, whether they had a stroke or a brain injury or have a disease like dementia, they check no. But realistically, then that is technically lying to the state if we do. And I think that's one thing just we were talking about before, just doing more education with the state on some of those things in conjunction with us and letting them know these things. Because I have individuals that after they had a severe stroke and all of a sudden they're in a wheelchair and they can't walk anymore, and they check that box no, and there's no questioning even from the people at the state DMV, like, did your medical status change? And they'll say no because there's nothing on record from previously. If they look though, and obviously it did. So the one thing though, to be aware of that, and that's the state licensing authority, when we check no, that is actually, we're lying to the state licensing authority that that person actually does have a disability that might affect their driving when they check no.
Can I add something to that? So that's a good point. So I also have the clients that have checked yes, I haven't had a change, and so sometimes they'll get, when they check yes, they may get a letter in the mail from the state saying they're requiring a medical statement from their doctor to say yes, they could still drive, or no, they can't drive. So lots of times the doctor will say, maybe I'm not an expert in driving, so why don't you do this comprehensive driving assessment, and then we'll see how you do, okay?
And just another remark here, there is really no use for me to argue about the issue of driving when I consider the liability, safety to others. It is simply isn't worth it. And that's a lot of times when we're reviewing things and with loved ones and their family members that we just come back to. So what if it was a grandchild that was crossing the road and you injured that grandchild? I know deep down someone would feel absolutely horrible if that happened. So just looking at those liability issues, do we want a lawsuit later in life? I'm sure anyone here absolutely would say, no, we don't want a lawsuit later in life. So looking at the risk factors. So we talked about this a little bit before. I'm just going to go a little bit more in depth with looking at some of this information with some of your checklists. So how to ease a transition to a non-driver. So really with those early conversations, if you guys look, I think in the envelope, and then we also had, I think we double copied, but I don't think you can go wrong with getting extra information. But there is kind of a sheet that goes through conversation planner. How can I have good conversations about not driving with your loved ones? And it really goes into the different areas of who, when, and what. So first off, just identifying who should be the messenger in talking to your loved one about the driving issues. Is it the son or daughter that lives across country and really doesn't have any contact with that individual? Is it the neighbor that actually is really close and has provided some services and is closer support to that individual? So really looking at who that would be, because someone might be more receptive with an individual that is more closer to you versus a relative that's across country. And then also, when is a good time to talk? So as we talked about before, the earlier, the better. So one, we can kind of catch these things early on, but also I always think talking about earlier, the better, because sometimes as driving specialists, when we get someone way later on within the disease, and then we have to be the bad guys and say no driving, and they're totally shocked. Where if we start these conversations earlier and then kind of, make recommendations, okay, now you can only drive locally and not at night, maybe now to the just grocery store, and just kind of gradually make that transition a little bit easier, then they might be more apt to follow those recommendations. So the other thing, it gives you just some suggestions on this sheet just to start thinking about what do you want in your conversation to accomplish. So keeping your conversation when you're starting to talk to a loved one about driving or not driving, so keeping the conversation simple, short, direct, and just focus on one or 2 points, not going deep in depth in it right away. So some of these statements you'll see through this worksheet that might kind of stimulate some of these conversations, like, when you go to the grocery store, can I go? Or instead, let me drive. We're willing to drive, but you have to let us. Or the mall is having a sale. What if I pick you up? And start making those suggestions to where you can kind of transition that person that you might be doing a little bit more of the driving as a caregiver. The other thing, suggestion about, kind of opening up these conversations is, I'm noticing some scrapes on your car. Where did those come from? That may mean that there could be a problem with your maneuverability in driving. So I think this conversation planner on how you can have a good conversation can kind of go through the who, when, what, and really helps with starting those conversations. And then within that too is just brainstorming and starting to develop a plan of who can offer support. So I think the biggest thing is when we start talking about these early conversations, or when we tell someone we can't drive, and even if they have really good family support, the number one thing is someone says they don't want to be a burden. Then starting to develop a plan that it's not always the caregiver, giving rides. It's not always the kids. Looking at all kinds of different transportation options that I'll get into next. So one of the things, there are some benefits of not driving. It saves money. So in some of the sheets, there actually is this transportation cost worksheet that you can think of all the expenses you would need with a vehicle, whether it be you're leasing it, you have a car payment, okay, there's so much money there. How much gas you use, the maintenance on a vehicle, long-term maintenance, purchasing tires, brakes, all those major things. In addition, then there's a cost for insurance, registration. That adds up. So if you think of just making a list of all of those expenses of what it would cost to drive, and then kind of turning that around as an annual cost and looking at, okay, if I do have to pay a little bit here and there for some other modes of transportation, I'm actually might be saving money here, even if I do have to pay for some modes of transportation. So really contrasting all those costs for you driving on your own versus the other transportation methods. Other benefits of not driving. So as we know, with any disease, increasing health and wellness. So maybe if you can't drive anymore and it's close to you, to be able to walk over to the grocery store or walk to some of these small errands that you can run. So any whatever disease it is, it's good to stay physically active. And then also even the expansion of social networks. So maybe socially you might have a group of friends that still drive, but maybe asking them, once a month, can I get a ride from you to go to this church gathering? So really expanding that social network. And we know with any disease too, with our mental health and well-being, socialization really increases our abilities throughout the day. All right, looking next into transportation alternatives. So there are also sheets in your packets and really identifying a whole list of what are your driving activities. So where, when, and why. And the sheet on that is driving activities, when, where, and why. So looking at those trips that you go routinely, so those frequent trips, the places that you might go daily or weekly. So is that shopping? How often do you do that? And what changes could you make to that to reduce the need to drive? So, and then also going into your periodic and occasional places that you go. So occasional places, I might go up to Duluth once a year to visit family members or on vacation. So really mapping out all those different areas that you would drive to, and this will kind of help you come up with, I call it more of a transportation plan if you were not able to drive. So once you map out all those different driving activities of where you absolutely need to go, when, and why, then you can kind of incorporate looking into different transportation alternatives. So out there with different transportation alternatives, public transportation, private pay, ride sharing, community shuttles. Also, if your loved one is transitioning into assisted living facility, a lot of those communities might have different shuttles that run to those different places. So then in getting there that way and not needing to drive. So another sheet that was in there is getting there using alternative transportation. So we gave you a whole list of Ramsey and Hennepin counties for transportation options, and then also different options for getting things like meals and other everyday activities that might interfere if you can't drive. So on the sheet with getting there using alternative transportation, really coming up with a plan. So what are those family members that you can rely on? Friends, private program services. Do you need to get set up and registered through Metro Mobility to get to your medical appointments? Do you want to use mass transit? Just depending on everyone's needs and abilities, just really looking at all those different transportation options and identifying. And then also looking at the cost of those too. So looking at how that would fit your budget within the transportation options. So does anybody have any additional questions as we went through the information in the last parts? So she had mentioned that she lives next to a group home and she's wanting to know more information on how she would inquire about applying for Metro Mobility. So that's kind of the biggest one within, if you guys all live within the Twin Cities area. I think the harder part, if we live on the outskirts, finding those transportation methods. If you are online savvy, they have a application online that you can download. And you're going to want that application because part of the sections of the Metro Mobility application do have to be filled out by a physician. So to start that process.
Mm-hmm. And I think in your packets under the Hennepin County alternative transportation, there is a number for Metro Mobility underneath there. So you can call them too and request an application if you are not online savvy. So the question is, what would you recommend as far as reassessment and how often? And is it based upon a mini mental assessment or is it just the warning signs? Very good question, and that's something I wanted to touch base on with that. So after the assessment is done and when I go over the outcomes, and I say, okay, you can drive still, but with certain restrictions. So along with that, I might say, because this is a progressive disease, I usually recommend at least a yearly assessment, okay? But if you see major changes, and I'm going to give them a sheet that says what's called a family drive along or a friend drive along, where a friend or a family member can ride in the car with that person maybe every other month to kind of see what their driving skills are like. So see where they're driving in their regular environments, and if they see more red flags, like lane positioning or missing stop signs or more dents in the car, then they can come and see us before that yearly timeline. But this is just kind of a way of keeping track of where their driving skills are. The question is, if somebody ranked really high on the mental exam, should they still be driving? Should they not be driving? It depends. It depends on the person, because sometimes in the clinic, somebody may test okay, but or not test very well, but when they're driving, it may be a different ballgame. They still may have those driving skills intact. So that's why we always do both parts when they do a reassessment, because we want to see the comparison and usually there is a comparison. Okay, so the question is, if there's a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease and they take the driving assessment and they pass, do they have to report that to an insurance company? No, they do not have to report that to an insurance company. But I usually highly recommend that they give us the authorization to send it to the doctor, so the doctor has that in their files, that they do this on a yearly basis.
So the question was, we can't necessarily, if we give them recommendations of no driving, can't force someone to give up driving, what can we do? Privately, like she said, you can't force information to go to the state, to the doctor. And there's been some changes within the VA system of just about reporting. The one thing, if someone is adamant, and I had a guy just yesterday, but he unfortunately came alone, and ran 2 stop signs, and it was just down the street in his local area, and he said, I am not giving up driving until someone takes away my keys. So in a situation, let's just say, I'm hoping to follow up with the family members and get that authorization. The one thing that we tell people, even though the family members don't want to be the bad guy, you got to take away those keys, okay? The other thing that sometimes we tell people is if they just are so prideful that their car is in the driveway or they just want to go look at it in the garage or something, disable the battery. Take the battery out. The car won't start, but maybe, later that day they'll call the mechanic and then they'll figure out that there's no battery in there. And then also, we really try to, in that follow-up conversation, just even though sometimes it's just in one ear and out the other, just really what the consequences are. So like I said with that statement before, I'll say to my clients, you are such an honest, sweet man, and they are. I'm not lying about that. But you would feel horrible if that was your great-grandson, that you could not react in time and you hurt someone or someone else or yourself. And then sometimes that statement really hits home. Not saying all the time, but these are just some different things that we can do. And then they're like, you're right. So sometimes even in the clinic initially, someone will be adamant, but it takes time to even process that information. So it will just take time to even process the information of not being able to drive again. We don't expect someone, when we tell them that they shouldn't be driving, just to accept that right then and there. I mean, it will take time to accept that.
So she's asking, I know we mentioned as far as funding resources, that one of the state agencies that can cover is called Aida Weber, but she's also asking if the elderly waiver covers it. I've only had, in the 6 years I've been there, I've only had 2 people that have had the elderly waiver covered. It's not a normal circumstance that we will get clients on the elderly waiver that have used that as a source of paying for the driving assessment. Question is, I know you mentioned driving or no driving. Is there a middle road? Okay. Yes, there is. So if we recommend, if they do the driving assessment, and I recommend, yes, you can drive with certain restrictions. So, driving within your 10-mile radius from home, so you can go to church, so you can visit your son's house, okay? Or just driving during the day because your vision, when I tested you in the clinic, you weren't able to see in those types of environments. Or I might say no rush hour or no freeway, because that ability to multitask is a lot more difficult. Or that person drives a lot slower when I saw him behind the wheel. As a last resort, for someone that does not want to give up driving, can we turn them in? And the answer is yes. Okay, so you can contact the state, or you can have that person's doctor contact the state and say that person is still driving and is a risk. Okay, so they can turn that in.
It won't. You would have to release that information to your doctor, and the doctor would have to release that to the state to have those specific restrictions on the back of your license. So if you don't authorize that, as therapists after our driving evaluation, ours are truly recommendations because we do not have the authority to send those to the state. But there are some people then that release the information to their doctor, and their doctor would send it to the state, and it might say, no freeway driving, just like corrective lenses. It's the same restrictions on that area of the back of your license, or no night driving, those kinds of things, but that would have to be released. But just to piggy off that, the one thing that I do tell people, even though We can give recommendations, and if we do not, if our patient does not authorize the information to get sent to the state, I do tell people that this is in your medical record, and in your medical record, if we are saying no driving or to follow these restrictions, and you do not follow these restrictions, you go get in an accident and hurt someone, they will pull your medical records, and you will be liable. But also, too, you got to think about still with this aging population, and we get a lot, sometimes the spouses still don't drive. And so, you know, the male in the relationship is the primary driver. So that's kind of a difference, too. But I think obviously with the different generations, that's changing more and more.
Yeah. You know, I see both male and females primarily in my practice, and I do have to say the majority of the clients that I see are the males. But I do see a handful of females that are very adamant to keep driving there, but they are able to, sounds kind of stereotypical, but once we give the outcomes, I find that the females tend to take the outcomes a little bit more at ease versus the males. Okay. So his question is, does anyone here have personal experience with Metro Mobility, and if they could talk a little bit about their experience and what's the wait time between picking up from home and waiting at the doctor's office, etc. Do you have experience?
The waits with Metro Mobility were average 45 minutes to an hour, and the waits were so long that I ended up just using taxi cabs for shorter distances. The Metro Mobility has changed. They used to give vouchers so that once you qualified for the program, you could use the vouchers with taxis, and that was an awesome system. Now, you can wait 45 minutes to an hour to get picked up to go to an appointment. Now, when you want to leave the appointment, you have to wait again that long to get picked up, and it may take you 45 minutes to get home, in addition to waiting to be picked up. So there's really long wait times with Metro Mobility. It works, but if you're an avid reader, pack a book and you'll be okay.
So I think along with that, in your packets with the resource list of the alternative transportation, there's lots of options. So rather than just Metro Mobility. So when I talk to the client as well as the family about it, I say, don't just rely on one source. Try to explore some of the other things that are on there and have different options. Maybe just use this for, your appointments to doctors and use this other service or to get to the gym, so that you're not just totally relying on one source.
And then wherever you live, if you go to a local senior center, they might even have some additional smaller companies that provide transportation options too.
Yes, and has everyone heard of senior linkage? Oh, good, yes. So that is, I think that's also in your packets. That's a great resource, and so if you live outside the area, you can call that number and they can link you to other resources outside of these two counties. Yes, so the question is, how about the other kinds of newer ways of alternative transportation, such as Uber and Lyft, where typically you can go online or and call them and say, it's kind of like a taxi service if you've never heard of it, but it's a lot more, I guess, cost effective. And the other issue with that is there are only a couple places around the United States that are piloting the handicap accessible ways of getting around, but Minnesota isn't one of them. So having to comment on that. I can't really comment on those particular things except for my personal experience with using Uber. I found it to be very easy, user-friendly, if you are technologically savvy. Okay, so if you are okay with, if you use a smartphone and you have an app, it's really easy. You can easily just say, okay, I'm here, can we get a ride? And that's really convenient. But for someone that is not as savvy technologically, it may be a little bit more of an issue. I don't know what else to comment.
Yeah, I was just thinking the same thing, just since this was focused more at dementia and the cognitive skills that come with that, being technologically savvy, and then I don't know, just, not that I had problems with Uber, but since they're starting to get more regulations and don't have as many regulations, I just think of people getting taken advantage of, and that's all
Right.
just for safety. Still, I mean, you need to have the cognitive capacity to follow those rules of the road out there. And so, not that there's direct correlation, but someone, depending on the stages that they would be in, and that's why that was one thing that a lot of places mentioned, like biking and walking, but also you have to have the cognitive capacity if you're going to start walking to not walk across the street when it doesn't tell you to make the judgment calls and processing speed, how fast those cars are coming so you don't get hit. So, and then now, honestly, with distracted drivers, and there was just the other day, what was that in Bloomington, and a pedestrian got hit, and I just think there's more concerns for that because so many people are distracted drivers now, looking down at their phones, that I think there's a high risk of actually being a pedestrian or a bicyclist more than there used to be.
Yeah.